The room smelled like burnt coffee and condescension. 12 men from the SAS had flown into Ramadi in January 2005, carrying Bergen packs, 2 satellite phones, and a planning methodology that predated GPS by 4 decades. The American officers seated across from them had access to 2 Predator drones running continuous surveillance feed, a helmet system valued at over $40,000 per operator, and a classified intelligence apparatus that consumed more processing power per hour than every computer in the building combined. Captain Alan Wardell of 22 SAS set a laminated map on the table. The map had colored string on it. One of the analysts present, a man from the Defense Intelligence Agency who had been in country for 11 months and carried the particular kind of institutional confidence that comes from never having been seriously wrong, looked at the map, looked at Wardell, and looked back at the map. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The expression said everything the formal record would later omit. February 14, 2005. Wardell was presenting the 4th operational proposal his squadron had submitted in 5 months. The previous 3 had been rejected in writing, each time with identical language inserted into the formal record. Force size insufficient relative to operational objective. Translation: too few men, too little equipment, too much confidence in both. Don't send the British. The objective was a fortified compound in the northern sector of Ramadi, a structure housing an estimated 600 AQI-affiliated combatants operating across a logistics and command network that American forces, despite a 4,100-man task force and 9 months of uninterrupted surveillance, had been entirely unable to dismantle. The estimate described the compound's total fighting population and support presence across the site, not 600 men standing alert in one courtyard at one moment, which was precisely why Wardell believed a small force could break the place faster than a large one could surround it. Wardell had a proposal. Midway through the briefing, the analyst interrupted him. The question wasn't hostile exactly. It carried something worse than hostility. Amusement. He asked, with the careful neutrality of a man who has already decided the meeting is over, whether the SAS intended to take the compound with fireworks and goodwill. Wardell waited 3 seconds. He looked at the map. Essentially, yes, he said. Through the 3 corridors you marked as impossible. The room laughed. Colonel Richard Mercer, commanding officer of the task force, let it run for a moment before moving to close the session. The proposal was logged, formally stamped, and rejected before Wardell's team had cleared the building. 5 months later, that joke was cited verbatim in an official report submitted to the Pentagon as the operational tactic that ended the insurgent campaign across Anbar province. Nobody in that room was laughing then. This is not a story about luck. Luck is what men invoke when they cannot explain what they witnessed. What happened in Ramadi between February and July of 2005 was not luck. It was not improvisation, and it was not the product of desperation. It was the result of a specific kind of mind operating at the precise threshold where institutional contempt becomes a tactical advantage, where being dismissed entirely frees a man to do what the cautious would never permit themselves to attempt. What you are about to hear is the full account of how a single sentence, spoken in a room full of people who had already stopped listening, became the most effective counterinsurgency maneuver executed in Anbar province during the entire duration of the Iraq War. The men who laughed that February morning were not stupid. They were experienced, decorated, and operating with the best intelligence infrastructure the United States military had ever assembled in a forward combat environment. That is precisely what makes this story worth telling, because competence, when it calcifies into certainty, stops being an asset. It becomes a blind spot. And blind spots, in the kind of war Ramadi had become by 2005, were fatal, not always to the men who carried them, but invariably to the objectives they were meant to protect. Wardell never asked for a second chance. He didn't need to ask. He already knew something that 4 rejected proposals and a room full of laughter had failed to take from him. That the 3 corridors marked impossible on that American map were impossible only to a force too large to use them. He had 12 men. That was not a limitation. That was the weapon. Colonel Richard Mercer did not arrive in Ramadi to lose. He was 51 years old. He had 23 years of active service, 2 combat deployments in the Balkans, 1 in Afghanistan during the early weeks of Operation Enduring Freedom, and a professional record that the Department of Defense had described, in the formal language of evaluation reports, as consistently distinguished. The kind of man who made other men straighten their posture when he entered a room, not because he demanded it, but because his presence made it feel appropriate. By February 2005, Mercer commanded a task force of 4,100 personnel operating out of Ramadi under Joint Special Operations Command Authority. His intelligence infrastructure included 2 MQ-1 Predator drones running overlapping surveillance rotations across the city, a signals intercept platform processing upwards of 300 communications intercepts per day, and a forward analysis cell staffed by 43 intelligence officers, drawing from satellite imagery, human intelligence networks, and classified feeds that most officers of equivalent rank would never receive clearance to access. His annual classified operational budget was estimated at $840 million. He had more combat resources concentrated in a single urban environment than most countries fielded across their entire armed forces. He had been trying to dismantle the northern sector compound for 9 months, 9 months of surveillance, 9 months of intercepts, 9 months of Predator footage, targeting packages, joint planning sessions, revised approach vectors, and updated threat assessments. The compound remained operational. The network it housed continued to move personnel, material, and command communications with a consistency that bordered, in the private assessments of his own analysts, on the deliberate, as if those inside knew precisely what Mercer could see, and had arranged themselves accordingly. This was the environment into which Wardell's squadron had been inserted in October 2004. They arrived without announcement, without ceremony, and without the kind of formal coordination request that would have given Mercer's staff the opportunity to manage their presence before it became a factor. 4 weeks later, they submitted their first operational proposal. Mercer reviewed it, forwarded it to his planning chief, and had it returned with a single-line assessment: insufficient force size for the stated objective. The proposal was formally rejected on November 19, 2004. A second proposal followed in December, a third in January 2005. Each was constructed with greater specificity than the last: more detailed terrain analysis, more precise entry timing, more granular breakdown of force allocation across the 3 approach corridors. Each was rejected with language nearly identical to the first. Mercer did not personally respond to any of them. There was no discourtesy in that. There was simply a judgment, made early and held consistently, that a 12-man element had no viable contribution to make against a target of this scale. That was not arrogance. It was, in the honest assessment of every conventional military calculation available to him, arithmetic. On paper, unsupported penetration by a force this small risked producing exactly the sort of politically catastrophic failure for which commanders are removed and remembered. When the SAS entered that briefing room for the 4th time in 5 months, in February 2005, Mercer was already seated at the head of the table. He had reviewed the proposal the previous evening. He had reached his conclusion before the session began. He was about to have the worst professional year of his career. The first rejection arrived on a Tuesday, November 19, 2004. Wardell received the formal response through the standard coordination channel: a single-page document bearing the task force letterhead, 2 signatures, and 1 sentence of substantive content. Force size assessed as insufficient relative to operational objective. No elaboration. No alternative recommendation. No invitation to revise and resubmit. The document treated the proposal the way a man treats a bill he has no intention of paying, acknowledging its existence without conceding its legitimacy. Wardell filed it, said nothing to the Americans, and began writing the second proposal that same afternoon. The second rejection came in December. The language was different by 4 words. The conclusion was identical. One of Wardell's sergeants, a man named Briggs, who had been with the regiment for 11 years and had developed the particular kind of institutional patience that only repeated exposure to bureaucratic refusal can produce, read the document twice and set it face down on the planning table without comment. He did not ask what they were going to do next. He already knew. He had been watching Wardell work for 9 weeks. He understood that rejection, for this man, was not a terminus. It was a data point. The third proposal, submitted in January 2005, was the most detailed document the squadron had produced since arriving in country. 41 pages. Terrain analysis drawn from 11 nights of close reconnaissance conducted without American support or authorization. Entry timing calculated against the compound's observable guard rotation patterns. Patterns Wardell's team had catalogued manually, by eye, from positions the Predator drones never covered because no analyst had thought to look there. Force allocation broken across 3 corridors with contingency sequencing for each. The document was, by any honest measure, a serious piece of operational planning. It was not a claim that the work was finished. It was the first version of the plan Wardell believed was operationally sound enough to execute, with the remaining months used to tighten margins rather than to discover the idea itself. It was rejected in 8 days. This time, there was an addition to the standard language. A handwritten note, clipped to the cover page, from one of Mercer's planning officers, a man Wardell had never spoken to directly, suggesting that the SAS element might find more productive application in a supporting role to a larger conventional operation being planned for the eastern districts. It was phrased as a suggestion. It was not a suggestion. Wardell read the note once, removed the clip, and placed the handwritten page in a separate folder. He kept that folder. The fourth meeting, on February 14, 2005, had a different quality to it from the moment Wardell's team entered the room. The American officers were already seated. Coffee was already poured. The atmosphere carried the particular low-energy courtesy extended to an appointment that everyone present knows will be brief. Wardell stood at the head of the table and began presenting. The room listened, or performed the motion of listening, for approximately 4 minutes. Then the DIA analyst interrupted. He framed it as a question. The tone said otherwise. He asked, with the measured patience of a man addressing someone who has failed to understand a simple concept after multiple explanations, whether the SAS contingent was proposing to neutralize a compound housing 600 combatants using 12 men, no air cover, no armored support. And what he described, with a slight pause that the room interpreted as wit, as 3 corridors that his own team had specifically flagged as tactically non-viable. Wardell stopped. He did not look at the analyst. He looked at the map, the same laminated sheet with the colored string that he had carried into every one of these rooms, that had been glanced at and set aside 4 times now, that contained on its surface a geometry of approach that no one in this building had yet been willing to read correctly. He let the silence occupy the room for 3 full seconds. Essentially, yes, he said. Through the 3 corridors you marked as impossible. Because those are the 3 corridors they stopped defending. The room laughed. Mercer brought the session to a close with the practiced efficiency of a man who has better uses for the next hour. The proposal was logged at 10:47 in the morning. The rejection was processed by 14:15. Wardell's team cleared the building before 11:30. Nobody shook hands at the door. What no one in that room understood, what none of the 43 intelligence officers, 2 drone feeds, and $840 million in operational infrastructure had produced a single document acknowledging, was that Wardell had not been making a joke. He had been telling them exactly what he was going to do. They had not listened. That was the last mistake Richard Mercer's task force would make in Anbar province. What nobody in that room knew, what 43 intelligence officers and 9 months of uninterrupted surveillance had not produced a single line to suggest, was who Alan Wardell actually was. Not his rank, not his unit. Those were on the cover page of every proposal they had rejected. What they did not know, and had not thought to ask, was what it had taken to produce a man capable of walking into that room 4 times, absorbing 4 institutional dismissals delivered with increasing condescension, and walking out each time with his operational judgment entirely intact. That is not a common quality. It is not trained in the conventional sense. It is produced, slowly, through a specific sequence of experiences designed to determine, with clinical precision, whether a man's confidence in his own assessment survives contact with conditions that would cause most men to revise it. The SAS selection course is conducted in the Brecon Beacons in Wales. The mountains there are not dramatic by global standards. They are not tall enough to be impressive and not remote enough to be romantic. What they are is relentlessly, specifically hostile. Cold, in a wet, bone-penetrating way that equipment addresses inadequately, with terrain that degrades in unpredictable patterns and weather that changes without the courtesy of a transition period. The final phase of selection requires candidates to complete a 64-kilometer navigation march alone, carrying 30 kilograms, in under 20 hours. The route is not disclosed in advance. There are no teammates. There is no support element. There is a start point, a set of checkpoints, a weight requirement, and a time limit. Everything else is the candidate's problem. Men have died on that march, not metaphorically, not in the bureaucratic language of training incidents. Died of exposure, of exhaustion, of the particular physiological failure that occurs when a body is asked to sustain a physical output its reserves can no longer support. The regiment does not publicize these events, and it does not alter the course in response to them. The course is what it is because the regiment needs to know with certainty that the men who complete it will not stop when stopping becomes the rational option. Wardell completed selection in the winter of 1994. He was 22 years old. The temperature during his final march was recorded at 4 degrees below zero, with wind conditions that pushed the effective temperature lower. He carried 31 kilograms, 1 kilogram over the minimum requirement, a detail noted in his assessment file and never explained. He completed the 64 kilometers in 19 hours and 4 minutes. When he reached the final checkpoint, the directing staff member present noted in the written record that Wardell's first question upon finishing was not about food or water or transport back to base. He asked whether the checkpoint coordinates for the third leg had been intentionally set to funnel candidates toward the exposed ridge, or whether it was a consequence of the route design. The directing staff member wrote in his assessment, "Candidate demonstrates tactical analysis under full physiological depletion. Recommend immediate continuation." That was the beginning. What followed over the next 11 years was a professional record that the regiment's internal archives would eventually describe, in the measured language of institutional documentation, as one of the more complete operational biographies produced by an officer of his tenure. 6 deployments. Sierra Leone in 2000, during the hostage rescue operation that most of the British public never received a full account of. Afghanistan in 2001, inserted within weeks of the initial campaign, operating in the eastern provinces under conditions that the official record describes only in general terms. Afghanistan again in 2003, this time embedded with a joint task force running a targeting program against a network that had been assessed as disrupted and had demonstrably not been. Bosnia in the intervening period. 2 additional deployments that remain classified under provisions that show no current expiry date. Across those 6 deployments, Wardell had operated in environments where his force was, by conventional military calculation, insufficient for the stated objective in every single one. Not occasionally, every single one. The SAS does not deploy at scale. It deploys at the minimum size required to achieve the specific effect, into the specific gap that larger forces create by their own presence. The noise, the footprint, the logistical signature, the predictable movement patterns that a force of 4,000 personnel cannot suppress regardless of training or intention. The regiment had understood this since its founding. David Stirling had articulated it in the Western Desert in 1941, when he proposed to the British High Command in Cairo that a small group of men operating at night against Axis airfields could achieve what entire armored divisions had failed to accomplish from the front. The High Command had rejected the proposal. Stirling had executed it anyway, with 66 men divided into small teams and destroyed more aircraft on the ground in 6 months than the RAF had managed to shoot down in the same period. Wardell had read Stirling's original proposal. He had read it as a young officer and returned to it repeatedly throughout his career, not as a historical document, but as a working manual. The logic it contained was not specific to the Western Desert. It was not specific to the 1940s, or to airfields, or to any particular geography or era. It was a logic about the relationship between force size, defensive predictability, and the specific category of gap that large forces create and cannot see because they are too large to look into it. The 3 corridors in Ramadi's northern sector that the American planning cell had marked as tactically non-viable were non-viable for a force of the size that cell was designed to deploy. They were too narrow for armored vehicles. They lacked the lateral space required for a standard infantry element to maintain formation integrity under contact. They offered no helicopter landing zone within acceptable extraction range. Every one of these constraints was real. Every one of them was also irrelevant to a team of 4 men moving on foot in the dark who did not need vehicles, did not maintain formation, and had no intention of requiring extraction from a landing zone. The corridors weren't impossible. They were impossible for everyone except the people the compound's defenders had never planned against. Wardell had understood this from the first night of close reconnaissance in October 2004. The 11 nights that followed had confirmed it, with a precision that the Predator drones, operating at altitude on programmed flight paths, were structurally incapable of producing. He had watched the guard rotations. He had counted the intervals. He had identified the 3 windows, not metaphorically, but precisely, with times noted and cross-referenced across multiple nights to establish pattern reliability, during which all 3 corridors were simultaneously unmanned. The windows lasted between 9 and 14 minutes. They occurred at irregular intervals that, when plotted against the compound's observable internal schedule, resolved into a pattern with a confidence level that Wardell's Sergeant Briggs, who had no formal intelligence training and considerable practical experience, described simply as, "They don't know they're doing it." The compound's defenders had built a defensive posture around the threat they expected. A large force, arriving from the primary approach axes, with vehicles and air support, and the kind of noise signature that provides 30 seconds of warning to anyone paying attention. They had not built a defensive posture against 4 men moving through corridors too narrow to be worth defending. You do not defend a space that no rational actor would attempt to use. That is not negligence. That is basic resource allocation. It is also, when the actor on the other side is specifically selected and trained to be irrational by conventional military standards, a fatal assumption. 4 proposals, 5 months, 4 rejections. None of it had changed what Wardell could see on that map. The string wasn't decorative. Each color represented a corridor. Each corridor had a number beside it. Not a label, but a time. The time the window opened. The time it closed. The margin of tolerance Wardell had calculated based on 11 nights of observation, adjusted for variables he had identified and weighted individually. The map was, in the most precise sense of the term, a solution. It had been a solution since November 2004. It had been sitting on that table, in front of a room full of people who had the resources to execute it and had declined to read it. When the DIA analyst had asked his question in February, the one about fireworks and goodwill, Wardell had looked at that map and experienced something that the formal record would never capture and that no debrief would fully retrieve. It was not anger. It was not frustration. It was the specific, clarifying recognition that comes when a man understands, completely and without residual ambiguity, that he is going to have to do this alone. He was not troubled by that. He had done everything alone before. July 14th, 2005. The temperature in Ramadi at midnight was 32 degrees Celsius. It had not dropped below 31 at any point in the previous 6 days. The air carried the specific quality of heat that accumulates in urban environments over extended periods, not dry, not clean, but dense, with the residual warmth of stone and metal and compacted earth that had been absorbing sun for weeks and releasing it slowly into the dark. It was the kind of heat that degrades concentration at the margins, that makes a man fractionally slower to process what he hears, fractionally less precise in the calibration of distance and direction. For a large force moving with vehicles and equipment, it was a minor variable. For 12 men whose operational margin was measured in seconds and meters, it was a factor that had been accounted for in the planning and would need to be managed in the execution. Wardell had been awake for 19 hours. This was not unusual. In the weeks between the February rejection and the July operation, Wardell's squadron had conducted an additional 23 reconnaissance insertions into the northern sector. None of them authorized through the American Task Force Coordination Channel, none of them logged in the Joint Operations Record, none of them conducted at a scale or with a noise signature that would register against the compound's established alert threshold. The purpose was not to gather new intelligence. The corridor mapping had been complete since January. The purpose was to establish pattern baseline data across a sufficiently long observation window to reduce the margin of uncertainty in the timing calculations to a level Wardell considered operationally acceptable. By late June, it was acceptable. On July 12th, Wardell convened the final planning session with his 3 team leads. The session lasted 4 hours and covered, in sequence, insertion routes, rally points, individual team objectives within the compound perimeter, communication protocol, action on for 7 contingency scenarios, and extraction sequencing. No element of the session covered what to do if the windows did not open on schedule. That was not an oversight. Wardell had cross-referenced the window timing across 41 observation nights spanning 9 months. The pattern had held without a single exception. He had made a decision. The kind of decision that cannot be made by committee and cannot be defended in advance to anyone who has not stood in the positions he had stood in, at the times he had stood in them, watching what he had watched, that the pattern would hold on the night of the 14th. If he was wrong, the operation would fail in its first 4 minutes, and the debrief would be a short document. He was not wrong. At 02:17 on July 14th, 3 teams of 4 operators each departed from separate staging positions on the periphery of the northern sector. Team 1 moved northeast along the first corridor, a drainage channel running parallel to the compound's western wall, 1.4 meters wide at its narrowest point, completely absent from every American targeting package because it had been assessed as too confined for operational utility. Team 2 took the second corridor, a gap between 2 derelict structures on the compound's southern approach that the Predator footage showed as a dead zone, a blind spot in the surveillance geometry that Wardell had identified during his 3rd reconnaissance insertion in November 2004 and had not mentioned in any of the 4 proposals because he had not wanted it closed before he could use it. Team 3 moved along the 3rd corridor, a rooftop traversal route across a row of adjacent buildings to the east, requiring a controlled descent of approximately 6 meters at the terminal point, which Wardell's team had rehearsed 11 times in a separate location. Each team leader carried a watch synchronized to the same reference. Each team moved on foot, in single file, at a pace calibrated to place them at their respective entry positions simultaneously at 03:44. The opening of the window Wardell had calculated as the most reliable of the 3 recurring gaps in the compound's guard rotation, based on frequency of occurrence and average duration across the full observation dataset. Radio communication during the movement phase was reduced to single-syllable confirmations at 3 designated checkpoints per route. 1 click. Checkpoint reached on schedule. 2 clicks. Checkpoint reached with delay. Continuing. Silence for more than 90 seconds at any checkpoint. Abort signal for all teams. Wardell monitored all 3 channels simultaneously from a position at the midpoint of his own team's route, moving and listening, adjusting pace in real time against the confirmation signals coming in from the other 2 corridors. There was no air cover, no drone overhead, no quick reaction force positioned within viable response range, no extraction helicopter on standby. The American task force, operating from its forward base 3 kilometers south, had no record of any British element being active in the northern sector that night. Mercer's operations center was running its standard overnight shift, 2 analysts monitoring the Predator feeds, 1 signals officer processing intercept data, 1 duty officer managing the communications log. None of them had been informed. None of them would understand the scale or nature of what had happened until the decisive phase was already over. At 02:41, Team 2 reached its first checkpoint. 1 click. At 02:44, Team 1 reached its first checkpoint. 1 click. At 02:51, Team 3 reached its first checkpoint. 1 click. The drainage channel in Team 1's corridor narrowed to 90 centimeters at a point approximately 400 meters from the compound wall. The lead operator made the passage in 11 seconds, The man behind him made it in 8. The third man caught his equipment on the channel wall and spent 6 seconds clearing it. 4 seconds over the threshold Wardell had set for individual obstacle transit. He cleared it. He kept moving. The pace adjustment required to maintain schedule was calculated and absorbed within the following 50 meters. At 003:19, Wardell heard 2 clicks on Team 3's channel. Delay. He checked his watch, assessed the margin, and continued moving. Team 3 was running 40 seconds behind schedule at checkpoint 2. Their route had a built-in buffer of 70 seconds between the second and third checkpoints, designed specifically to accommodate this category of minor variance. Wardell had put it there in January, in the version of the plan that the American task force had rejected without reading past the third page. At 03:31, Team 3 sent 1 click, back on schedule. The compound's guard rotation, as Wardell had observed it across 41 nights, proceeded as follows. 2 sentries maintained fixed positions at the primary entrance on the compound's northern face throughout the night. A third sentry conducted a mobile patrol covering the eastern and southern perimeter on a rotation that averaged 22 minutes per circuit, with a variance of plus or minus 4 minutes depending on conditions. The 3 corridors Wardell's teams were using became simultaneously unguarded during the interval between the mobile sentry's departure from the southern perimeter corner and his return to it. A window that opened on average 11 minutes after the fixed sentries at the northern entrance completed their own internal handover rotation, and closed when the mobile sentry circuit brought him back into line-of-sight coverage of the eastern approach. On 41 observation nights, this window had lasted between 9 and 14 minutes. Wardell's confidence in it did not rest on a fantasy of mechanical perfection. It rested on the narrower assessment that any deviation significant enough to matter would almost certainly occur only after some interior sign of trouble had already begun to pull the patrol off its habitual route. At 03:39, the fixed sentries at the northern entrance completed their handover rotation. At 03:41, the mobile sentry departed the southern perimeter corner and moved east. At 03:44, all 3 teams sent simultaneous single clicks. Position reached, 12 men, 3 corridors, 3 entry points, 0 enemy contact. The compound's 600 occupants were, at that moment, entirely unaware that the space between their walls and the city outside had been crossed, quietly and completely, by the force that the United States military's most sophisticated intelligence apparatus had formally assessed as too small to matter. Wardell checked his watch. The window had been open for 3 minutes. It would stay open for between 6 and 11 more. He gave the signal. The signal was not a word. It was a single compression of the transmit button, 1 click, sent from Wardell's position at the eastern entry point at 03:44 and received simultaneously by all 3 team leads. No voice, no confirmation request, no acknowledgement required. 11 months of preparation had produced a plan precise enough that the only communication required to initiate it was the one that said, now. The 3 teams moved at 03:44 and 14 seconds. What followed over the next 37 minutes has been described in subsequent operational debriefs, classified assessments, and at least 2 internal regiment reviews, using language that tends toward the technical and away from the dramatic. Force multiplier effect. Simultaneous multi-vector penetration. Degraded command coherence in the defensive element. These are accurate descriptions. They are also descriptions that process what happened in Ramadi's northern sector compound on the morning of July 14, 2005, through a vocabulary designed to make extraordinary things sound procedural. What actually happened was not procedural. It was the outcome of a specific thesis about the relationship between size and surprise, executed by men trained to operate at the precise point where those 2 variables intersect most violently. The compound's defensive architecture had been built around a single foundational assumption, that any threat would announce itself before it arrived. A large force generates noise. It generates light, movement, vehicle signatures, radio traffic, the accumulated sensory output of hundreds of men and machines converging on a single point. That output is detectable. It provides warning. Warning provides time. Time provides the opportunity to consolidate, to communicate, to position. 600 men in a fortified compound have significant defensive capacity when they have time to use it. They have substantially less when they do not. Wardell's 12 men generated no detectable output. They had crossed the perimeter through corridors that the compound's defenders had implicitly removed from their threat model. Not through negligence, but through the entirely rational calculation that no force capable of threatening them would attempt to use spaces that confined, that dark, that tactically disadvantageous by every conventional measure. The compound's sentries were watching the primary approach axes. The surveillance positions covered the roads. The alert protocols were calibrated to the signatures of the threat that experience and logic said was coming. The threat that actually came did not match any of those signatures. The first indication that something was wrong reached the compound's internal command position at 03:51. 7 minutes after the teams had entered, via a report from a sentry who had heard movement inside the eastern perimeter that he could not account for. The report triggered a standard internal alert sequence, a communication to the secondary command position, a request for status from the mobile patrol, and an order to consolidate the guard element at the primary internal choke point until the source of the movement was identified. The mobile patrol did not respond. The secondary command position did not respond. By the time the first sentry completed his second attempt to raise either position, Team 2 had already neutralized both. This is the mechanism that Wardell had designed, and that no one in the American Task Force's planning cell had been willing to read carefully enough to understand. The simultaneous entry across 3 corridors did not simply place 12 men inside the compound. It placed 12 men inside the compound's communication architecture at the same moment, cutting the lateral connections between defensive positions before those positions could respond to each other, before the alert could propagate, before the 600 men housed in the compound's interior could be roused and directed and formed into the coherent defensive mass that their numbers theoretically represented. 600 men who cannot communicate with each other are not 600 men. They are a series of isolated groups, each facing a threat of unknown size and origin, each waiting for a command from a command structure that no longer exists. The compound's 600 occupants had been reduced, in operational terms, to something significantly smaller before most of them understood that anything had begun. At 04:03, Wardell sent a 2-click signal on the command channel. Teams acknowledged status. All 3 teams responded with single clicks within 8 seconds. No casualties, no compromised positions. The operation was proceeding within its planned parameters at 19 minutes elapsed. At 04:11, the mobile sentry, the same individual whose predictable patrol pattern had been the structural foundation of Wardell's window calculation, was located by Team 1 at a position inconsistent with his standard rotation. He had deviated from his circuit, apparently in response to the earlier report of movement. The deviation had brought him into a corridor he had never, across 41 nights of observation, previously entered. That mattered less than it would have at the perimeter, because by 04:11, the teams were already inside the communication chain Wardell had come to break. Team 1 adjusted. The adjustment cost 4 minutes. Wardell noted it. He kept moving. At 04:29, the compound's primary command position was reached by Team 3. The 2 individuals present offered resistance for approximately 40 seconds before the position was controlled. Neither was the network's senior commander. Intelligence had placed him in the compound's interior residential block, which was Team 2's assigned objective. The resistance was noted, managed, and recorded. It did not alter the operation's timeline in any meaningful sense. At 04:44, Team 2 reached the residential block. The senior commander was present. He was located in the position that Wardell's reconnaissance data had identified as his standard overnight location, a detail derived not from satellite imagery or signals intercept, but from 11 months of systematic, unauthorized, entirely unassisted observation conducted by men operating on foot in the dark through corridors that their most generously resourced allies had marked as not worth using. He was taken without incident. He said nothing to the men who entered the room. He looked at their equipment, the modest weight of it, the absence of the technological apparatus he had been briefed to expect from British Special Forces. And his expression, according to the Team 2 operator who filed the contact report, was not one of defeat. It was one of confusion. At 0451, the compound was under control. 12 SAS operators. A compound holding 600 combatants and support personnel, its command structure severed, its lateral communication broken, its interior movement channels fixed before the majority of its occupants understood what had happened. 3 corridors that every American assessment had marked as tactically non-viable. 0 friendly casualties. Total rounds expended across all 3 teams in 37 minutes of active operation. 37. 1 round per minute. 1 round per man. The most efficient use of force recorded in Anbar province during the entire duration of the Iraq War had been executed without air support, without armored vehicles, without a drone overhead, and without the 4,100-man task force 3 kilometers to the south, fully understanding what had happened until the critical phase was already complete. Wardell keyed his radio at 0453 and transmitted 2 words to his team leads. Clear. Out. There was no celebration. No exchange of words between teams as they consolidated. No moment of reflection on what had just been accomplished. These were not men who required external confirmation of their own assessment. They had known since November 2004 that the corridors were real, and since January 2005 that the operation built around them was sound. The months that followed had been spent refining the margins, not revising the conclusion. They had been permitted eventually, by no one, which was, in the regiment's understanding of such things, a form of permission entirely sufficient for the purpose. They moved to the extraction point in the same silence in which they had arrived. The compound's 600 occupants were processed, documented, and transferred to American Task Force custody over the following 6 hours. The network they had housed, the logistics chain, the command communications, the personnel pipeline that Mercer's task force had been unable to disrupt in 9 months of continuous effort, ceased to function as an operational entity within 72 hours of the compound's fall. The campaign in Anbar province, which had been assessed by multiple intelligence bodies as likely to continue at elevated intensity through the end of 2005, underwent a measurable and documentable degradation from which it did not recover. The string on Wardell's map had been right. Its logic had been right in November 2004, when it was first placed on a table in front of men who did not read it. By January, the plan built on that logic had become executable. In February, it had already become obvious to the only man in the room who understood what he was looking at. It had been right when the room laughed. It had been right when the 4th rejection was processed at 14:15 and filed in a folder that Wardell had kept with the same deliberate patience with which he had kept everything else that this operation had required him to carry alone. The compound was silent now. The map, back at the staging position, still had its string on it. Wardell had not removed it. The report landed on the Pentagon's desk in September 2005. 34 pages, Colonel Richard Mercer's name on the cover, the task force letterhead, the standard classification markings. Inside, a formal operational assessment of the action conducted in Ramadi's Northern Sector compound on July 14, 2005, its execution, its outcomes, its implications for counterinsurgency doctrine in urban environments. The language was precise, measured, and entirely consistent with the institutional register of a document produced by a man who understood that what he was describing would be read by people whose opinion of his command would be shaped, in part, by how he described it. The document contained 34 pages. Not one of them mentioned how the idea had started. There was no reference to a briefing room in February, no reference to a laminated map with colored string, no reference to a DIA analyst's question about fireworks and goodwill, or to the 3 seconds of silence before the answer, or to the sound of a room full of decorated officers laughing at a proposal that was, at the moment of its delivery, and at every moment between then and 4:51 on the morning of the 14th, completely correct. The report described the tactic using language that had been developed, presumably with some care, to make it sound as though it had originated within an institutional planning process rather than in the mind of a man whose 4 previous attempts to share it had been rejected, stamped, filed, and forgotten. The phrase used was multi-vector low-signature simultaneous penetration methodology. Wardell was not consulted during the drafting process. He was not informed when the report was submitted. He learned of its existence through a regiment liaison officer 6 weeks after it was filed. He read the relevant sections once, returned the document to the liaison officer, and said nothing about it that was ever recorded. There was nothing to say that the record would have been capable of containing. The report was the record. The record said what it said. What it did not say existed in a separate category entirely, the category of things that institutions process out of their own accounts of themselves, because the alternative requires acknowledging a failure of judgment that no formal document has a mechanism to accommodate. What the formal record will carry permanently and without revision is the following: 4,100 American personnel, 12 British operators, $840 million in annual operational infrastructure, 1 map, 1 compass, and 3 corridors rejected in writing. 9 months of uninterrupted surveillance by the most technically advanced intelligence apparatus deployed in a forward combat environment in the history of the Iraq War. 11 months of unauthorized foot reconnaissance conducted without support, without authorization, and without any resource beyond the accumulated judgment of men trained to see what larger forces are structurally prevented from seeing. 4 proposals submitted, 4 proposals rejected. 1 operation executed without permission, without support, and without any modification to the core plan that had been on that table since November 2004, and refined into final form by January 2005. 600 combatants, 12 operators, 0 friendly casualties, 37 rounds, 37 minutes. A network that had survived 9 months of a 4,000-man task force ceased to function within 72 hours of 12 men walking through corridors that had been marked, in formal writing, as not worth using. The numbers tell the story. They always do. What the numbers cannot tell, what 34 pages of precise institutional language are constitutionally incapable of recording, is what it costs a man to be right 4 times before anyone permits him to prove it. The patience required. The specific discipline of carrying a solution through 4 rejections without allowing the rejections to alter your assessment of the solution. The particular kind of silence that a man must maintain when a room full of people laugh at the most important thing he has ever said, and he understands in that moment that arguing is not the correct response. The correct response is to wait, to watch, to keep the map, and to walk through the corridors they said were impossible. Quietly, in the dark, while everyone who said so is looking somewhere else. Richard Mercer's report was cited in 2 subsequent joint doctrine publications as a foundational case study in small unit operational effectiveness in complex urban terrain. The methodology it described was incorporated into planning frameworks used in later campaigns. The name Alan Wardell does not appear in either publication. The colored string on the map was never photographed, never catalogued, and never entered into the operational record. It is not clear what happened to the map. It is entirely clear what it proved. Institutional confidence is a resource. Like every resource, it can be over-applied. Like every resource, when it is over-applied consistently enough and against the same problem for long enough, it stops producing results and starts producing assumptions. And assumptions, in the kind of war that Ramadi had become by the winter of 2004, were indistinguishable from vulnerabilities. The SAS has known this since David Sterling walked into Cairo in 1941 with a proposal that the High Command rejected and executed anyway with 66 men. Some lessons take longer to learn than others. Some institutions require the same lesson several times. The compound in Ramadi's northern sector was quiet by sunrise on July 14, 2005. 3 kilometers to the south, Mercer's operations center was running its standard morning shift. The overnight communications log showed nothing unusual. The Predator feeds had recorded a calm night. The duty officer signed off the watch at 06 hours and went to breakfast. By then, Wardell's team had been back at their staging position for over an hour. The map was on the table. The string was still on it.